Welcome to Housing Matters, the Vancouver Real Estate Show. I'm your host, Stuart McNish, coming to you from the studios at Old Boy Productions, specialists in the development of shows like this one. This week, we take a look at what looks to be a stabilizing trend in the Greater Vancouver housing market. We have industry analyst Kevin Skipworth joining us with a boatload of data that says the market may have hit bottom and already started to rebound. Of course, homeowners are always watching what is happening to the value of their number one asset. But equally important, and maybe more so in a real estate that is so as expensive as it is here in Greater Vancouver, is rental. Over 70% of newcomers come to the area as renters. Where are we going to put them all? And how are we going to make that happen? Those questions are posed to David Hutniak of LandlordBC and Karen Sawatzky, a specialist in urban studies and a rental housing advocate. Joining me now is Kevin Skipworth, though, with his market report. Kevin, welcome.
Thank you.
Here we go, back into the fall. It's always a time when people start going, okay, what's happening in the real estate market? And we're starting to hear word that the downturn is over. And in looking at your figures, maybe, is it?
Yeah, I mean, when I look at the numbers, I was just working on my monthly report last night. We have seen an upturn in the last 3 months of the market. We saw 9 straight months of where sales were below 2,000 homes sold in Greater Vancouver. All of a sudden in May, that turned to 2,000. June, same thing, July, and then into August. So, we're starting to see a trend where sales are increasing from last year. We were about 16% above August of last year for sales. We were down from July, of course, but typically August is. It's not very often we see a July.
Right, and in relation to sort of peak of market, which is 2017, we're still down a little bit from there, but when I was looking at some of the figures in your report from the August issue, I'm going, okay, well, this isn't too far off. 2017 is definitely better than 2018, and it looks like things are sort of firming up.
Yeah.
That's on the sales side.
Yeah. On
the listing side, though, it doesn't look like there's a whole lot of people are saying, okay, I'm going to put my house out there. Like, the numbers are still down.
They are, and I put together an analysis about 2 months ago, and I looked at listing activity over the last 25 years, and we've had previous down markets back in the late 90s, 2008, 2012. A lot of people forget about 2012 being a down market, but it was one of the slower markets, actually worse than 2008. The listing activity was significantly higher, probably 25 to 45% higher in terms of listings, active listings. So we haven't seen a peak of listings like we've seen in the previous down markets.
So why do you think that is? Are there any indications as to why people are a little reluctant to list their homes?
Well, it's funny. I had somebody say to me, "Well, the market that we've gone through in the last year, there's a lot of panic in the market." And my point was, well, where's the panic? Sellers are not panicking to sell. They're quite confident in the prices. They've seen them drop, and then the higher end especially. I mean, it's kind of two different markets. But sellers they're not panicking to sell, and there's no great need, and there's a lot of waiting. They're waiting to see where the market's going to go. A lot of sellers want to move into something else, but they're waiting to see what they're going to buy into is going to be like. So it's just been a lot like a holding pattern, but no great need to sell it at a lower price that may achieve a buy right now.
Well, sure, and I guess the psychology around that is, well, if I throw it out onto the market and there is a plethora of listings, well, then prices, of course, are going to come down because buyers will look at it and go, I can pick and choose.
Yeah.
But instead, we're now starting to see people once again like bidding on property rather than just negotiating on what the listed price is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Last fall was probably the best time. Early this year was the best time to be buying because there was that mentality of you could negotiate with a seller to a greater extent. Some sellers were just not willing to negotiate, but you could find some that were a little bit more open, and you could find that one seller perhaps that you would get a below market price for a property. But now we're seeing that switch where inventory is dropping down again. We're down about 2,000 from where the peak of the market was in the spring, 2,000 active listings. So we're just above, right around 14,000 when we were close to 16,000 in the spring. So there's less available, and a lot of the stuff that's listed is either priced higher. It's been on the market for a while. Those sellers are not perhaps looking to achieve a sale at a reasonable price, and we've still got a number of properties which are forming part of land assemblies that show up on the market, and those are not properties that an average buyer is going to get. Those are ones, and they're not selling because developers are holding back on buying property right now because of the fluctuations in the market and the government regulations.
So they have a wait and see
Yeah.
mindset at the moment as well.
Yeah.
You know, we had a couple of realtors back here or in here in the spring talking about specific markets, East Vancouver being one of them, portions of Surrey, where they were going, well, what downturn? Even then they were saying, what downturn? They were dealing with multiple offers on homes.
Yeah.
Let's sort of talk about some of the markets. How's Greater Vancouver, like in the Greater Vancouver? Define Greater Vancouver first of all, and then let's go kind of like sector by sector, because some you see things moving and others it's a little slower.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at Greater Vancouver, we're pretty much from Whistler down through to the south into Ladner-Tuason, and then going east basically to the river. So, and that includes Maple Ridge and Coquitlam, Tri-Cities, New West, Burnaby. So when we look at the market in general, I mean, Whistler is a totally different market, different animal altogether. But certainly Vancouver West, Richmond, and West Vancouver, they've been a little bit different. The detached, especially. I mean, they've been highly affected by the tax changes above $3 million.
Yes,
that market has, we've probably seen prices off 30 to 45% in some cases.
And is that still the case in those markets?
Yeah. We've seen a few sales and above $3 million, and it has happened, and local buyers, and when we say local buyers of different ethnic varieties too, it's not that we're saying local has to mean Caucasian buyers. So we have a lot of different Vancouver is a melting pot of a lot of different ethnic variations. So yeah, I mean, but that end of the market has certainly suffered. The condo market, that one we saw a lot of inventory ramp up just because it sort of lags behind the housing market or the detached market. Well,
it takes time to build, for one thing.
Yeah. But so the housing market, detached market, inventories in the west side of Vancouver is actually quite low compared to other peaks of the market. We're sitting below 700 detached houses for sale. Back in 2008 and 2012, we saw over 1,000 active listings. So it's not like there's, again, this panic of places being put on the market and desperately selling them. It's just, people are picking and choosing whether they want to sell and if they have to sell and that. So,
but as we start moving east, I was out on my bicycle all over the Fraser Valley and Lower Mainland this past weekend, and I saw houses for sale in a wide variety of different communities. And then I was also quite astounded by the amount of new construction, particularly in Burnaby and Surrey.
Yeah.
So what's happening in Burnaby and Surrey?
Well, Burnaby, again, it's the detached market has slowed down. The higher price points have been tougher to sell. There's been more construction. Coquitlam, certainly there's a lot of construction there. Very much more pro-development in Coquitlam. Burnaby has been, but that's starting to slow off with the change in the municipal government. So you've got this inventory that's working its way through. But those markets, they've been active, but slow like everything else. And all the markets suffered through the last 9 months. We're now starting to see that change a bit, and it's when I look at month by month, it changes from month to month, and they're not all acting in concert with one another. We see some that are slower, and some months when they should be higher, and others, not the same. Like Port Moody had a great August. They were over 50% above sales from last August, and for detached. So,
and do we know why?
It's just sometimes a flavor of all of a sudden, you get a few people that start buying, they see a few sold signs, and all of a sudden that little bit of thought that, I better get in.
I better not miss out.
Yeah. My brother lives in Port Moody and said, oh yeah, this house that's been on our street for sale for a while, all of a sudden it's sold. And so, you start to see that happen and people take notice, like yourself. You notice the signs, notice the sold stickers that go on them.
Right. Is there any one particular market that has surprised you the most besides Port Moody?
Not particularly. I mean, Richmond has been slower this summer. I think part of that, is in fact probably due to some of the issues going on back in China and Hong Kong, a little bit of uncertainty perhaps. Richmond is kind of, again, it's two different markets. You've got the downtown Richmond, which is very much concentrated, a lot of mainland Chinese. And the outskirts of Richmond a little less so, but it's a dense mix of apartments in downtown Richmond. So you've got a lot of inventory, a lot of building that's gone on, and then you move outside of the peripheries, and it's less so. But it's been a little quieter, and that probably surprises me the most in terms of Richmond and just seeing. I live in Richmond and Steveston, so I see what goes on out there, and I've been a little bit surprised at the lack of activity out there.
So we talk about activity increasing, number of listings down. What's that doing in general? Because it's hard to be specific about every single property, but in general, what's that doing to prices? Are we seeing increases that are marginal, or are we actually starting to see the kinds of jumps that make you really pay attention?
I'd say it's leveling off more than anything. I read a report last week that said prices of apartments are starting to come off, condos, and they've already come off. I mean, we've seen an 8 to 15% drop in prices of apartment condos since last fall and pretty much since last spring after the stress test came into place in January 2018. So it's kind of like, we're seeing prices leveling off more than anything. We're not seeing those big jumps in offers. We may say multiple offers, but they may all be below the list price. Everybody thinks multiple offers means that you're going to get prices, above list, and somebody's going to throw crazy money at it. But we've seen more multiple offers, but more controlled ones where people are bidding under list, and perhaps the winner gets it at list price. So it's a more controlled environment, and because buyers are still cautious, they're not as resident to just throw money at something right now.
So would you classify this as being a good market because it appears to be stability returning, and as a result, people can make the kinds of decisions that they go, okay, I can afford to take the time to make the right decision for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's more balance in the market, definitely. There's more opportunity to do your due diligence. There's opportunity to make a move, from something to something else. And if you're trading up in the market, you'll do better because you're selling something at a price that, yes, you're getting less, but you're also buying something that's less. And the increase or the decrease is, when you look at a percentage basis, you're saving more on the upside of what you're buying. But there is more opportunity. We're seeing subject to sales where people don't have to jump in and purchase and then panic and say, well, now I got to sell over the next 2 months to be able to buy. We saw a lot of that in the previous market just because of the lack of inventory. There was just not enough supply and we saw a little bit of stuckness in that market because people were trying to purchase, but they couldn't find something to buy. They didn't want to list because they didn't want to be homeless, and so you saw that. So now we're seeing it a little bit at the other end of the market, or the other end of the situation where they want to buy but they need to sell, and so some do subject to sale and some will just put it on the market and try and get a price. But when you get somebody that's a little bit more motivated, they've got their eye on something, then they'll look at what they're selling and come off on price to achieve that sale of what they get into. But it's certainly more balanced. There's opportunity out there still. For a buyer, I think there's great opportunity. It's finding that right place. And if somebody's playing the short game and they want to buy and get out in a year and think they're going to make money, I never recommend that in any market because there's just too much that can happen. But if you're looking long term, you're looking to get into a home. Long term, Vancouver is a great market to be in. Where we'll see these downturns, they'll come back, and we'll see it come back up again.
Because people keep wanting to come to Vancouver and they need a place to live.
They do. There's lots of people coming here. There's lots of popularity. I talk to so many people in other places that love the city, that love to be here. We're seeing some of the high tech coming to Vancouver, and it's just there's only so much space to build on, and we see a lot of building, but we're still constrained by a lot of property under the agricultural land reserve, a lot of property that's zoned single family that cannot be built on to the extent of densification that's needed, and so there's a whole lot that needs to be done. And I think that's the problem right now is we're seeing government whacking demand with a stick, but they're not looking at really how to deal with the supply side, and we'll see these cycles continue.
Well, I'm glad you're watching, recording, and reporting back. I want to invite you now to come back again and give us an update in a month or so.
Absolutely, I would love to. No, I would be great to do that. Thank you, Steve.
Okay, great. Thanks for joining us. Joining me now is our next guest, David Hutniak of LandlordBC. This is going to be the first of what promises to be many conversations over the season that we're planning on having about rental properties in the Lower Mainland and in Vancouver. David, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a few months since you were last here. And when we last spoke, we were talking about the fact that there is a rental housing crunch throughout the Lower Mainland. I know that it's a short period of time and you can't alleviate these problems quickly, but are you seeing signs of any movement or easing up on that shortage?
Well, I mean, since we last spoke, absolutely there has been a flurry of activity. Burnaby, probably most notably, where they council there basically approved the sort of further consultation on a wide array of recommendations from staff for inclusionary zoning and renter displacement. Just they basically touched on a whole wide array of issues, and we can talk about those individually if you like. City of Vancouver also, their staff did a major presentation to council in November, I believe it is. They're going to be following that up with further recommendations. Same thing. They're looking at they were basically tasked with studying a whole range of issues and reporting back to council, and it's touched again on further tenant protection, reducing tenant displacement, but also about increasing supply, incentives to facilitate that. And then I guess the other city or municipality where there's been some activity, again, the month of June was a very busy month, was City of Victoria. In the City of Victoria, what really has come out of there is some very concerning, frankly, sort of a direction in terms of what we call residential rental tenure zoning. So this is like pre-zoning for rental, and in particular what they have focused on is existing rental, which, from our understanding of when this new legislative power was provided to them by the province, that was not really the intention of that new tool, and they're using it in a manner that is very, frankly, very harmful to owners of these existing rental buildings.
So for somebody who's not paying attention, what makes it harmful?
Well, at the end of the day, what they are basically saying, how they wish to apply this tool, and there may actually be a sort of a legal route for which they can do this, but effectively what they're saying is that they, if you have an existing purpose-built rental building, they are now going to, I think it's about 500 buildings, they're going to basically say all 500 of these buildings must remain purpose-built rental into perpetuity, no ifs, ands, or buts. Nominal consultation with the owners of these properties, and it amounts to what, frankly, in our opinion, and on many of our members, expropriation without compensation. Basically, they're saying this is what we're going to do. There's no option to opt in or out, and effectively, I've had this rental building for 50 years in Victoria. It has always been taxed in terms of property taxes on the basis of highest and best use. I've paid taxes on that basis. Well, highest and best use is condos. And it has a very different value attached to it, to that
Right.
land, basically.
And it's a value that keeps changing.
Absolutely. So I borrowed money on that basis, et cetera. So my whole sort of financial model is impacted. And there's just an opportunity to do this in a positive manner. And we certainly have been very actively involved in suggesting what those might be. But like I said, it's instead of consulting and looking at sort of a collaborative approach, maybe a little bit of carrot versus the big stick, they've chosen to go with the latter. And this is what's happening sort of more broadly, is that we've got tons of legislation that it's frankly, in terms of new construction of rental, purpose-built rental, rental developers are sitting on the sidelines. They're unsure of, what shoe is going to fall next from a regulatory perspective. And their lenders are saying, what's happening here? Like, there's just a lot of uncertainty. And, that's the worst thing we can do, is create all this uncertainty, because then they're risk averse at the end of the day.
So let's take a little bit closer look at what's happening in Victoria. For somebody who isn't a developer, they might look at what's happening there and say, well, no, that's good. You're preserving that rental property, and therefore you are ensuring that there's going to be an adequate supply in the future. But that's only looking at one side of the equation.
Yeah, but that's a good thing.
Yeah.
That's a really good thing, and we support that.
Yeah.
But what we're saying is how it's being done.
Yeah.
You see, what they could do is they could say, okay, Mr. Rental Property Owner, we would like to have this stay as purpose-built rental, this site stay as purpose-built rental into perpetuity. What we're going to do is, in exchange for that, is we're going to basically, at some point in time, it's going to need to be redeveloped. These are 50, 60-year-old buildings.
Because buildings don't last forever.
Absolutely. They don't last. So at that point in time, you're going to know today that you're going to have this amount of increased density bonusing. You're going to have parking relaxation. You're not going to have to go through a rezoning exercise and all that entails. It's going to be all spelled out up front. And so now I, as that owner, it might be 10 years from now, it might be 20 years from now, that I am going to redevelop that property. It's going to be necessary. But I'm going to know everything up front.
And that's going to have a long lens in my planning process.
Absolutely. So that's the way they should be doing it.
One of the things that I think about as you're talking about this, saying, okay, well, this is locked in, and there's nothing you can do about this building now. So you as a landlord say, well, okay, when it comes to maintaining it, I can't afford to maintain it, let alone upgrade it.
Yeah,
and then who pays the price?
Absolutely, that's absolutely right. So now all of a sudden, this property has been devalued. There's no question about it. And so now I'm looking at this as the owner. I'm saying, well, I've taken a 20-25% haircut overnight on the value of that property. Where's my incentive to make these, improvements to ensure that, it continues to last into perpetuity? So the whole business model basically is really disrupted. And so that's the thing. It's at cross purposes. Mm-hmm. It's at cross purposes with the goal that we all agree is the right goal. But what they're suggesting is at cross purposes with it.
So when you take a look at what happened in New Westminster, how is that different?
Well, okay, New West, it's a very, very sort of specific thing that they did. And they were purpose-built rental, but they were, what a lot of people don't appreciate is that they were actually in stratified units. Mm-hmm. And so what they did, they looked at these half dozen buildings and said, okay, we do not want you, the owners, to be able to ever sell the individual units off. So it was, a little more narrowly focused. They still took that new legislative power, but I think, as you're aware, there's litigation taking place here, right. And it does go back to and all these owners in New West in particular, none of them had any intention of doing that. I mean, they're in the rental business. That's what they want to do with these buildings. But they paid property taxes on the basis of each of these units being stratified.
Following the rules as they were laid out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They borrowed money against these buildings on that basis. They have, a property that is, basically subject to or open to highest and best use. So this is the thing. This changing of the rules overnight, without any consideration or compensation, whatever term you wish to apply. I mean, where's the fairness in that? And rather than sitting down with these owners and saying, okay, this is what our concern is, and this is a shared concern. Everybody knows that we need that old stock, that it is more affordable. We have a rental housing crisis. There's huge value in trying to maintain it.
Yes.
And obviously improve it. But I mean, again, it goes back to, can we do this in a positive manner, in a collaborative manner, and recognizing there's costs to do this. And if you have an intelligent conversation, the odds are pretty good you're going to have a mutually beneficial outcome. But it's this heavy-handedness, the absence of a carrot, all stick. And I think some of it is just, rationalized on the basis of a rental crisis. Well, we've had a rental crisis for decades. Okay, with all due respect.
Ever since we saw those federal incentives to build multi-purpose dedicated rental go away in the 80s, there's virtually been none built.
Because they've all, been hooked on the condo cash.
Yeah.
And I get that. But, we didn't create this crisis. And to really effectively knee-jerk on this, it's inappropriate, frankly. And it's unnecessary. So we'll see,
So you touched on inclusionary zoning, which Burnaby has introduced.
Yeah.
For those who are unaware of what inclusionary zoning is, how might that be a potential opportunity to create some new rental housing?
Well, I mean, I guess at the most, the simplest level, I guess in theory it will, because basically the city of Burnaby recently has said, okay, we'll let you build a condo with huge density bonusing in exchange for you basically, and don't quote me on the numbers here, but I believe it's 20% of the units have to be sort of a rental. Significantly below below market, and there's other conditions tied to it. And the one that's probably most significant of this is the fact that the units, the rent control, would be tied to the unit versus how it is today, which is tied to the tenant. So it's called vacancy control. And so this is heading down a whole nother path that. We have said, and frankly, the provincial government has agreed with us, that vacancy control would be hugely detrimental to the rental housing industry. It would ultimately hurt renters because it would just make the notion of providing and existing rental and building new, there'd be no justification to do it. So Burnaby, like I said, in terms of the recommendations that staff have put forward, and there's supposed to be more consultation, everybody has different views. I mean, we represent rental housing providers and rental housing, developers. Certainly, what we would prefer to see is that they have a policy and zoning that encourages the building of secure purpose-built rental everywhere, and that this inclusionary zoning model, at the end of the day, it's going to create some rental with conditions attached, but ultimately, the majority of the units in those towers are going to be high-end condos. And again, not everybody will agree with me when I say this, but I don't think that that's the right long-term strategy.
So one of the other things, before we run out of time here, is that we have so many different jurisdictions in the Lower Mainland and, of course, in other parts of the province. And everybody's talking about rental, but sometimes you think, well, in the city of Burnaby, they're doing this. In Surrey, they're doing that. In Langley, they're doing that. And at times, they're at cross purposes with one another. how important is it that we start to, because I know that the Greater Vancouver Regional District, when it comes to industrial land, at least has somebody who's saying, we're paying attention and we're working with one another so that you know what we're doing and vice versa. Is that an idea that maybe has some credibility here in the rental housing market?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fairness, I mean, Metro, they're doing interesting work on that whole front, and certainly the mayor's caucus, and they do meet and compare notes, etc. So there are a number of areas where there's a commonality in terms of trying to address this issue. But absolutely, to your point, I think right now it's still quite fragmented.
Yeah.
Every municipality has their own built-in Coquitlam solution or whatever it may be, and perhaps at the end of the day maybe that's not that's fine as long as the end result is there. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, what we need to get out of this rental housing crisis is to build secure, purpose-built rental housing across Metro. We've got 50,000 people a year coming in here, and we need to start zoning for renters and opening up the land that's available there. I mean, this is the other issue that's very frustrating. So yes, we don't want to displace existing renters from the existing rental stock, but that's the land that's designated for rental housing. So open up more land so we can build more purpose-built rental housing. It's not that complicated.
And some of that has been zoned for single-family homes, and a lot of those people go, whoa, just a second, not here. And yet we need to have an understanding that there is a need to bring in a wide variety of different kinds of specifically built rental properties. And they don't all have to be high rises or low rises. There are a wide variety of options that are available.
Absolutely. This is the thing. And see, this is where, the misinformation, the people, who object to this, they paint this, worst case scenario. Well, nobody's talking about putting, 20-story concrete building, in the midst of a single-family neighborhood. We already have. The West Side is a great example. There are, 3-4-story purpose-built rental buildings that are perfectly integrated into the neighborhood. Many people don't even know that they are purpose-built rental, So we have a lot of really smart people who know how to do this and create fantastic communities. So we need to get past sort of the hysteria around this and really start looking at what the options are. And I think we have a diversity of people and tenures in every community. I think that's good for healthy communities. And obviously, we need to build more housing and rental housing in particular. We have a limited amount of land. So we need to start thinking, much more progressively here, and we need our political leaders to really come to the table on this to jumpstart this. So we'll see. I mean, we were disappointed in Vancouver. I think you were watching the media about that 21 townhouse unit on Granville next to the hospice. So what that individual, the owner of that property, is going to do now is build a 12,000 square foot single family home because that's what it's zoned for. Well, we could have had 21 rental homes for 21 families.
There's a perfect example.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. So I'm out of time right now, but I'd like to have you come back a couple more times over this season, and let's just touch on a variety of other issues that are all relevant to this, because I think the more we know about it, the more we appreciate the value of rental housing, the better off the region's going to be.
And I appreciate you covering this as a real critical issue. You're doing a great job, so let's absolutely do that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Now, my next guest is Karen Sawatzky, who has had and continues to pay close attention to the issues that relate to the creation of rental housing in Vancouver. Karen, thanks for joining me. Welcome.
Thank you.
We have a serious rental shortage in Vancouver and in the Lower Mainland in general. From your perspective, and you have been a lifelong renter, I understand. You've been on the Rental Advisory Council or Committee to Vancouver City Council. You work in urban studies at SFU. Mm-hmm. What to you are the leading causes of the shortage here?
Well, I think that there's a bunch of policy issues that date back several decades, to do with how incentives, federal incentives, tax incentives to build rental housing that were in place in the sort of 60s to 80s
Right.
era. So that's one thing. There used to be more sort of federal mechanisms to encourage the building of rental housing.
And they kind of came to an end somewhere in the early 1980s, didn't they?
Yeah, late 1980s, I think.
Late? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then in that same time period, there was other things going on. So in 1966, we had the creation of a new form of multifamily housing, which was the Strata Act. So that, and that took a while to get going. But in BC, that law took effect in 1966. So as soon as that became possible to then have a new form of ownership, that there was an incentive there to build that type of housing instead. We also had rent control come in, and that provides a disincentive. So I'm not taking a position on any of these, mechanisms myself. I'm just saying there's a number of factors. So there's those things, and then I also think that within the city of Vancouver, there's also the fact that there's very little land south of 16th Avenue that's actually zoned for multifamily housing. And so if you want to build multifamily housing south of 16th Avenue, except in those few little pockets in Kerrisdale and so on arterials, you have to go through a long and expensive and uncertain rezoning process. And you know that in the current climate, that a lot of people, existing people in those neighborhoods that live in detached housing often don't welcome multifamily housing. So there's not enough space to build multifamily housing if you wanted to, even regardless of these financial factors. And you know that you're going to face community opposition. So there's many factors, and some of them are historical and outside the control of, say, our City of Vancouver government here, and more in the bailiwick of the province. But some of them, like our land use decisions, are squarely within the control of the local government, and I hope to see those change through the city plan process that's coming up.
I want to touch on one thing that you mentioned in there, and that was about rent controls and how they become a disincentive. For a lot of people, they go, well, hang on a second, how can that be disincentive? And isn't it ultimately beneficial to a renter to know that they're going to have a consistent rent, and then therefore they're going to stay there, and isn't there going to be a long-term benefit to the landlord because they know they're going to have a consistent occupancy?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the picture is complicated there. So again, I'm a renter. Obviously, I appreciate having, knowing that my rent can only go up by a certain amount and when per year. And when that formula was up for debate earlier, I think it was last year, the NDP government looked at that formula as part of its rental task force. I advocated for that formula to be changed to instead of 2%. I think it was 2% plus inflation. Now it's capped at, I forget what the old formula was, but now it's basically capped at inflation plus, I think, 2.5%. Anyway, it's capped. It's more certain now. So yes, I do appreciate it. But at the same time, as a renter, I also appreciate having places to live and choices about where to live if I want to or need to leave my current apartment. And in order for there to be places where renters, enough housing so that renters can move if they need to or want to for a whole variety of reasons, we might need to move, positive and negative. In the current situation that we're in, which is, we have a market economy, there has to be financial incentives for the rental industry to build rental housing. So I hope that we can, as a society, as a city, as a province, and, with the help of the federal government as well, come to a situation where it does make financial sense for the rental industry to build rental housing, market rental housing. And we can also have, certainty for renters and have controls on how much renters are able to pay, because renters are precarious. In a lot of cases, they make less income than homeowners as a group. And we need to make sure that renters can afford to stay in the city of Vancouver because for all kinds of reasons, because that's intrinsically important and fair, but also our economy would come to a standstill if we didn't have the renters able to do all the jobs that renters do.
Right. So, while rent control may be a benefit to a certain number of renters, it's a roadblock for developers because they go, well, there's not enough return on my investment. in even a reasonable amount of time for me to then say, well, I'm going to take the risk and the investment to build that property.
Yeah, well,
And so therefore then as a renter, you don't have options because that space doesn't exist.
yeah. So I'm not here to advocate against rent control, just to be clear. But
I just wanted a little bit of clarification
for sure.
around that.
No,
Yes.
I agree with what you're saying, and so I mean, there's some people that say we don't want, and we don't need any more market housing. They're against having market rental because they say, look how expensive it is, and what we need. The market can't solve this problem. We need all we should have, and all the city should permit is non-market housing. And, if that were the circumstances of the world, such that there was enough, funding from senior governments, or we would have to, increase local property taxes a lot higher. If that were the circumstances, I'm in favor of a lot more rental, non-market housing. I think we have a huge backlog of it, like we have a backlog of market rental. So we need lots more market rental, and I'm strongly in favor of that. That's how I vote. That's how I advocate. But we're not in that situation right now. And so I think that we also need solutions that work for the crisis that we have right now, because about 90% of our housing is market housing. So it's going to take a while if that's the goal. It will take a while to replace the funding to build the housing that we need at a non-market level.
So I was reading that we have a deficit of at least 10,000 units for rental just in the city of Vancouver. Is that accurate, or is it even more?
Yeah, I would say I don't know exactly where. I'm not familiar with where that figure comes from. It sounds very plausible and reasonable to me. I mean, we have a 1%, less than 1% vacancy rate, and generally a healthy vacancy rate for market rental is considered to be between 3 and 5%. The City of Vancouver's housing strategy, and this is one of the things that was important to me on the Renters Advisory Committee, was to say, since we're doing this new housing strategy that was finished in 2017, let's orient our rental housing goals towards achieving a healthy vacancy rate. Let's make that the goal. And so, in the City of Vancouver's housing strategy, it is oriented to achieve a healthy vacancy rate within the 10 years of the strategy. And to do that, the strategy indicates that we need 2,000 units of purpose-built rental housing per year. And then per year. 2,000 per year, and then more non-market, and that doesn't include basement suites, and that doesn't include laneway houses. It's 2,000. They've
purpose-built
rental, and again, that's about that. That the purpose-built rental is about getting the right supply, because secondary suites and rented condos are not secure.
No, they're not, because the homeowner can change whatever those conditions are at any time that they choose.
Yes, they have to give notice and such, but still, you're basically at the whim of a homeowner. So, there's a lot of things that the City of Vancouver can't control in terms of, our rental vacancy rate is a product of our job growth, when people come here and, for jobs. And obviously we want to have more jobs and more good paying jobs. So, making any kind of estimation like that is tricky. But so that's how I kind of think of it, is we need 2,000 units of purpose-built rental per year.
Well, I was also reading that 74% of people who come into the Lower Mainland
Households.
don't come here to buy, they come here and rent first, where they go from there afterwards. So they come into the market as renters.
Yes.
And to your point, if we want to be able to sustain the economy and bring in new workers, we have to have places for them to live.
Yeah, some of those people may, come here hoping to buy, but they're not able to do that for various reasons, because we don't have enough of that either, so it takes them a while. But yeah, it is the case that the percentage of a very high percentage of people coming here, households coming here, end up being rental households and they're either going to stay that way, or some of them may be able to transition. But yeah, and if those new people are coming in and working at jobs such as whatever, tech jobs, Amazon, and that kind of thing. If I'm working at a job that pays $20 an hour and looking for a new apartment versus an Amazon worker who's making, $60 an hour or whatever they make, who's a landlord going to choose? That's...
So there seems to be, from my perspective, at the moment, a tendency to say, well, if it's not what the council deems as affordable housing, then it's going to be very difficult to get permission to move forward and develop that. But what that designation about affordable is doesn't seem to fit what the cost of development and marketing or renting to cover costs. So does that not put another wrinkle in the equation? We've got a whole bunch of people who have money who want to rent, but the property isn't being built because it's not going to be affordable to somebody who is at the lower end of the income scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one thing we just have to grapple with, unfortunately, we may not like this reality, but we have to grapple with the costs to build rental housing.
Yeah.
In terms of, the major inputs are land costs.
Yeah.
And again, if there's only a small amount of land where people can build multifamily housing without going through a long, uncertain, and expensive rental rezoning process, that increases the cost to build multi-family housing because there's just not enough land to build it on, right? So we have to deal with the inputs to building rental housing, and we also have to deal with the fact that people are doing this as a business, that's just the reality right now. And again, I would love to see more nonprofits start up and whatever, but I mean, there have been 2 social housing projects come to this most recent iteration of council, since they were elected in November, since they started sitting in November 2018. There's been 2 social housing projects come. So, where are all the rest of the projects? I know that we've had some great, recent announcements from the federal government about, chipping in more money to make existing projects more affordable. So that's excellent news. And the province has done stuff there as well. But I mean, I think, if council is upset that, or, wants to see more affordable housing, they have to go, why have not, it's not that they're having a whole bunch of social housing projects come to them and then saying, oh, no, we don't want these projects. It's like, those are the projects that are, in the stream. And hopefully, we're going to see some more, I hope, I think at public hearing later this year and in the next year or 2. But it's not like there's a lineup of social housing providers saying, we've got the money to build social housing, right?
So we're in a bit of a catch-22 here, aren't we? And it's going to take a long-term vision from all levels of government to try and come up with a strategy that's going to be able to address this in an effective manner. Otherwise, I think the stalemate is that we're going to have people who are going to go, well, okay, I understand that you want rental housing, but I'm not building it. Find someone else.
Yeah.
And then we all lose.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I'm not in the development industries, but my understanding, what I've tried to learn about it to be a more effective advocate of rental housing, is that, there's not very many builders that build exclusively purpose-built rental projects.
Right.
They build condo projects, which pencil out much better for them in terms of making financial sense and getting a quick return so they can put their money into the next project. And then often they build other types of projects, maybe commercial and industrial too. So yeah, there's just not that many developers that's their only business. So they have, they're always looking for projects. And if rental projects don't make sense for them, I mean, we don't live in a society where we can make people do things, people who are in business, we can't make them do things that don't make financial sense for them.
Right.
And so, it was really great. Just before council broke for the summer, in late July, staff presented a really informative presentation about rental incentives to the city council because they had asked for that. And it was a fantastic presentation. I applaud staff for doing it. But the thing was and it was, it brought together a lot of information, and it's a great reference document. But, the conclusions of that were that in order to get rental housing built and to compete with, condo projects for, what developers want to do, we need to have incentives, and the incentives are working, and they're not they're kind of at the bare minimum level to make a project viable. So, and that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's all stuff that we've known since 2012 when the when the rental incentives programs got started. First with the STIR program and then the Rental 100 program. There's been ideological opposition to providing incentives for rental housing. I hope that with that presentation that, council is kind of closer to being on the same page and understanding that those rental incentives are, again, needed, not exorbitant, not giveaways to greedy developers, just what's needed to balance the equation. And then probably they're going to need, I mean, that was part one. Staff is coming back with the second part, recommendations for new rental incentives in the late fall. Probably, if anything, those incentives are going to need to increase in terms of being more flexible about parking, being more flexible about density, and those sorts of things, because that's just the way that the math works. And yeah.
Are you hopeful that we'll rise to the challenge, or will we be sitting here historically at less than 1% vacancy?
Yeah. Well, I am hopeful. I'm going to continue to be hopeful, and I'm hopeful because I think the data supports what I'm saying, and I'm open to revising my opinion if the data is not there. And I think that that will become apparent. Again, we haven't had that many rental projects come. We've only had, I think, about 9 projects come, purpose-built rental projects come to council. And we've got something like 500 and something units of purpose-built rental approved so far this year, when the target is 2,000. So they're at about 20, we know it's August, it's late August, and they're at about 25% of their target.
Wow.
So, if the incentives were so generous, were giveaways, I think that we would have a lot more projects coming to council saying, let's take advantage of these giveaways.
But they're not there.
They're not, you know. So I hope that we're going to, come to consensus and create a policy environment that allows for purpose-built rental housing to be built. Yes.
Well, I hope so too, because we definitely need that kind of housing.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming in and sharing this.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in on Apple Podcasts, thevancouversun.com, and theprovince.com, and of course on the Vancouver Sun's YouTube channel. I encourage you to subscribe because you don't want to miss an episode. As well, I want to acknowledge Arnold Chang, Greta Gibson, and Derek Hayter, without whom this show would not be possible. What a great team I get to work with. I'm Stuart McNish. Thanks for joining us on Housing Matters, the Vancouver Real Estate Show. See you next time.